My name is Michael Schuman, and I'm the author of the book Confucius and the World He Created. I started this book mainly because I couldn't find something that answered my questions about Confucius. And the more that I lived in East Asia, the more I came to realize that how important a figure he is in East Asian history and culture, civilization. Here's a guy who, lived 2,500 years ago, and he's had such influence over so many different aspects of life in East Asia, whether it's how companies run, how governments govern, how families interact with each other, how married couples deal with each other, that he's intruded on so many different aspects of life that he really has to be considered one of the founders of modern civilization. He's up there with Jesus and Muhammad and the Buddha and all these other great founders of doctrines. And yet I feel generally and especially in the West that he's often not put in that pantheon where I think he really deserves to be. So this book was really an attempt to, it started with me having a lot of questions I didn't have answers to. And it became something of, if you really want to understand East Asia, then you really have to understand this guy and what he's meant. Confucius was all about benevolence and morality, and he believed that if you acted in a benevolent fashion towards people around you, that meant good things would happen, and society would come to some prosperous, orderly state. Everybody would be happy, and this was basically true for everybody. If you have a king who's rules with virtue and benevolence, that means you're going to have a fantastic society and state. If you have a father who is supposed to be in charge of the family, but he kind of manages the family with kindness and righteousness, then you have a happy family. So if I'm going to boil Confucianism down to like one element, that would be it. Obviously, it's, as you said, it's much more complicated than that. That Confucius believed that you should spend your whole life trying to become a better person through education, through experience, and that it was a never-ending process, that no one actually was really ever perfect, that you had to continue to work at being perfect. And he himself, despite all of his study, and despite the fact that he was coming up with the doctrine himself, he didn't necessarily believe that even he was able to uphold it properly, but that life was basically a quest for becoming a better and better and better person. Confucianism became equated with being anti-modern. And this idea that held itself in place through basically through the early 1960s. And then some of these societies, at first not China, but starting in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, started to do pretty well. They started to basically more or less outperform economically generally everywhere else in the world. So then people kind of started looking at this and studying this, saying, okay, well, what makes these countries different from all these other countries? And, surprise, surprise, they come up with Confucianism and said, well, it's because of the Confucian work ethic, because of traditions of education from Confucianism, because of the role of government in society, in Confucian societies, and all of these kind of came together with kind of new capitalist ideas, and suddenly you have the superpowered Confucian capitalism, and now Confucius is okay again to have around. And then that kind of continued on till the 1990s, and then you started having economic crises in these same countries, and then somehow Confucius gets blamed for that as well. So you've had all of these amazing flip-flops back and forth. I think for me it shows two things. One is that the influence of Confucius and Confucianism has been so great on these societies over time that people analyzing what's going on end up with Confucianism somewhere, whether for good or for bad. Somehow Confucius comes up. I think the second thing, though, is the danger of, I'm very wary of seeing economic events in cultural terms. My background is actually economic development. So once you get into this idea that certain societies are culturally predisposed to be wealthier or are better able to achieve economic results, then you get into this really awful idea that certain societies are kind of destined to be poor simply because of the way that they operate. It doesn't really make any sense. So I think what you've seen is also the danger of trying to analyze current events through the prism of very ancient traditions, and how that can kind of start leading you somewhat astray or down kind of at least blind alleys in kind of analyzing events. Here we are in the modern day, and East Asia is becoming more and more important globally in economics and politics and in security issues, in culture, in global culture, and China especially, of course, rising on the world stage. And if we in the West are going to deal with this and understand it and find a future going forward that accommodates this rising East Asia, then we have to know more about where these societies came from, how they operate, what people want, what makes them tick, and that's going to make it a lot easier to deal with what is really probably the great geopolitical shift that the world is facing over the next 50 to 100 years.